He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. After my 12-year-old grandson called me, I drove straight to the emergency room, my heart in my throat. He could barely get the words out. He told me, "Grandpa, Mom won't wake up." When I arrived, the doctor pulled me into the hallway, shut the door, and looked me dead in the eye. She told me my daughter had 48 distinct injuries all over her body, and there was absolutely no way this was an accident. And when I turned around, my son-in-law was just sitting there in the waiting room, completely unfazed, acting like it was just any other Tuesday. Right then, I knew someone was trying to cover this up. You know how she is, Dad. Thank you for sitting down to listen to this story. Before we go any further, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Your city, your country. It truly means the world to me. Please note that this story contains carefully structured elements for narrative purpose, but the message it carries is something I believe you need to hear. The notebook was almost completely full. Almost completely full. I had kept up this habit every single night for 35 years. Same brand, same size, same pale yellow lined paper with a red margin line running down the left side. Every night before I went to bed, I wrote down one thing, one real event, one thing worth remembering. My wife, June, used to tease me about it. She said, "You know how she is, Dad." She said I was the last man on earth who still relied on a physical journal and a lead pencil. She claimed it was because I was afraid of commitment. But you can erase a mistake, that a pencil is honest. But you can always see the shadow of where you tried to hide it. It was 1 a.m, and I was sitting at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of me, trying to remember what I had intended to write. Outside, the old pecan tree in the backyard was scraping against the fence in the November wind, the way it always did whenever a cold front swept down across the manhandle. June had gone to bed around 10. You know how she is, Dad. The house was filled with that specific kind of quiet that only exists after you have shared a space with the same person for decades. It wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy and comfortable. I knew every corner of that house, smoothed by time like river rocks. Dad, I was 68 years old, 3 years retired from Harlow High School, where I had spent 35 years teaching 10th grade American history. I spent all those years trying to make teenagers care about people who were long gone, which is a lot harder than it sounds. You know how she is, Dad. The students who actually paid attention, the ones who really listened, were the ones who took my favorite phrase to heart. History belongs to the people who write things down. Record the truth. Date it. Put it somewhere safe. I had absolutely no idea that as I sat in that quiet kitchen, sipping cold decaf coffee and staring at that nearly full notebook, I was about to need that as an exact lesson for myself. The phone rang at exactly 2:07 in the morning, the precise time. I know the precise time because I looked directly at the microwave clock when the sound shattered the silence. A phone call at 2 a.m. always causes a physical jolt in your chest. Your instinct immediately tells you that whatever is being delivered in the middle of the night isn't going to be good news. The screen showed my grandson Lucas's number. Before I even answered, my hand started to shake. Grandpa, his voice sounded small and distant. Grandpa, his voice sounded small and distant. You know how she is, Dad. It was the sound of a young boy trying with everything he had to sound grown up and failing completely. Grandpa, something is wrong with Mom. She's on the floor and she won't get up. My chair screeched against the linoleum as I stood up, nearly flipping it over. I was already moving toward the hallway, calling out for June, my heart pounding so hard I could feel the pulse in my jaw. "Lucas," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady, trying to act as an anchor for him. It was completely forced, pure willpower. "Lucas, listen to me. Is she breathing?" "I think so," he whimpered. "She made a little sound when I touched her shoulder, but she won't open her eyes. And Grandpa, there's blood on the floor by her head. I don't know what to do." "I don't know." "Call 911 right now," I told him. "Can you do that for me?" "Hang up with me and call 911, Dad said. He paused, taking a ragged breath that cut straight through me. Dad said if I called anyone, he would... "It's okay." "Okay. Grandpa, I'll call." I was already at the bedroom door. June was sitting upright, her gray hair loose around her shoulders, sheer, blinking in the sudden light. "You know how she is, Dad?" She had the instant reflexes of a woman who had spent 30 years staying alert for sick children and early morning schedules. "Get dressed," I told her. "It's Beth." I don't want to dwell on the drive to Harlow Regional Medical Center, mostly because the details are a blur. Atid laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad. I just remember the headlights cutting through the pitch-black November night and the way June's hand gripped my forearm on Highway 9, squeezing so tight it left red marks. I kept picturing my grandson Lucas pressing those buttons on his phone, his father's warning echoing in his ears, choosing to make the call anyway. Atsmani, Nusinglipple, Nuniwede. You know how she is, Dad." I remember the sheer weight of that thought settling into my chest, a mixture of immense pride, profound anger, and a grief too heavy to name just yet. When we finally pulled into the hospital parking lot, I saw Todd Grady standing right outside the emergency room entrance. He was wearing his jacket. You know how she is, Dad. Hands stuffed deep into his pockets, with a practiced look of concern plastered across his face. "You know how she is, Dad." It looked like something he had rehearsed in a mirror. That wasn't the face of a man whose wife was fighting for her life inside. It was the face of a man waiting to be observed. "You know how she is, Dad." As our headlights swept over him, he looked up and gave a small, tightly controlled wave. June's fingers dug into my arm until I could feel her knuckles. "Earl," she whispered. "Just my name, nothing else." "I know," I said. "You know how she is, Dad." I pulled into the first open spot and turned off the engine. "June, no matter what we find inside, we keep our heads. We listen. We don't say a single word we can't take back. You know how she is, Dad." She looked at me in the dark car, her eyes bright with terror, and nodded. It was the tight, "You know how she is, Dad," rigid nod of a woman who had spent the last 20 minutes holding herself together by a thread, determined not to break. "You know how she is, Dad." We got out and walked toward the entrance. I didn't look at Todd as we passed him, even when he said, "Earl, June, thank God." I kept walking, and June walked right beside me, the automatic doors sliding open and swallowing us whole. The emergency department, know how she is, Dad. The emergency department at Harlow Regional smelled of heavy floor cleaner and recycled air, but beneath all of that was a scent your body recognizes before your brain even processes it, the smell of severe trauma, the aftermath of a night that had gone completely off the rails. The nurse at the reception desk started to stand up the moment we walked in, but before she could speak, a petite woman in her mid-40s stepped out from a side hallway. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, she wore green scrubs, and her hospital ID card was clipped to her pocket. She carried that profound stillness common to people who deliver devastating news for a living, knowing that quiet composure is the only kindness they have left to offer. "Mr. and Mrs. Sutton," she said. "Mr. and Dr. Patricia Holt, I've been treating your daughter. Before you see her, I've been treating your daughter. Before you see her, I need to speak with you." Beside me, June let out a soft, involuntary sound. You know how she is, Dad. It was the sound of a fear finally being confirmed. I reached over and took her hand, gripping it tightly. Tell us, I said. You know how she is, Dad. Dr. Holt led us into a small family consultation room just off the main corridor. It had 4 vinyl chairs, a box of tissues on the side table, and a single window overlooking the parking lot. She closed the door behind us but didn't sit down. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, looking at both of us. I could see her choosing her words carefully, like someone picking their steps. Even crod, unevenjured, she began. Your daughter has been severely injured, she began. She was unconscious when she arrived. We have stabilized her, and her vitals are holding steady for now. But I need to be entirely transparent about what we found, and I need you to hear this before you walk into her room. How bad is it? I asked. Dr. Holt met my gaze without flinching. There are 48 documented injuries across her body, all in various stages of healing. The number hit me like a physical blow. The number hit me like a physical blow, a sudden force slamming against my ribs. June's hand convulsed in mine, her rings cutting into my palm. 48? June whispered, her voice sounding faint, as if it were drifting from miles away. Patricia, 48? Some are recent, Dr. Holt said, her tone measured and precise. She knew that every word she chose right now would stay with us for the rest of our lives. Some are weeks old. Several of the bone injuries show calcification patterns that indicate they occurred anywhere from 4 to 8 months ago. She paused, letting the reality sink in. Mr. and Mrs. Sutton, I have been practicing emergency medicine for 17 years. What I am looking at is absolutely not the result of a single accident. This is a continuous pattern. This is continuous. Someone has been doing this to her intentionally, repeatedly, over a very long period of time. No. June's knees simply gave out. She didn't hit the floor completely because she caught herself against the back of a chair, her whole body trembling as she let out a sound I had never heard before and hoped to never hear again. You know how she is, Dad. It wasn't a standard cry. It was something older, a primal expression of a mother realizing everything she had failed to see. I put my arm around her, holding her up. You know how she is, Dad. My own legs felt unsteady and my heart was hammering against my chest, but I locked my knees and stood straight. June needed someone to lean on. You know how she is, Dad, and I was the only one left to hold the line. I want to see her, I said. You know how she is, Dad. My voice sounded flat and unfamiliar, like it was echoing from the end of a long tunnel. Please, I need to see my daughter. You know how she is, Dad. Dr. Holt led us down the hallway to a room near the very end. She stopped outside the door. Prepare yourselves, she said quietly. There is significant bruising on her face. You know how she is, Dad, and she has a sutured laceration on her scalp. Both of her forearms are bandaged. She is heavily sedated right now, but she is stable. She looked at both of us intently. She is alive. Hold on to that. Then she opened the door. The room was blindingly white, cold. You know how she is, Dad, and completely quiet, except for the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. June walked in ahead of me and froze just 2 steps past the threshold, slamming her hand over her mouth, her entire body going rigid. You know how she is, Dad. Lying in that bed was Beth, my daughter, 34 years old. The same girl who used to fall asleep on the couch during Friday night movies and wake up furious that she missed the ending. The girl who called me every single Sunday morning just to chat about nothing in particular. You know how she is, Dad. The girl whose hand I had held 6 years ago as I walked her down the aisle handing her over to Todd Grady, believing with a father's simple hope that she was stepping into a good life. Her left eye was swollen shut, surrounded by a deep, ugly, yellowish purple bruise that proved the injury was days old, not hours. You know, she is Dad. A patch of her hair had been shaved on the right side of her scalp, revealing a neat row of black stitches. White gauze ran from her wrists to her elbows on both arms. A clear line ran from the back of her hand up to an IV bag hanging from a chrome stand. June walked over to the bedside, sank into the vinyl chair. You know how she is, Dad, and took Beth's bandaged hand in both of her own, finally letting the tears fall. 60 miles about it. It wasn't loud sobbing, it was just a quiet, endless stream of tears from a broken-hearted mother who couldn't stop. I stood at the foot of the bed, staring at my daughter, forcing myself to look at every single mark, the way I used to train myself to face hard things. Turning away wouldn't help her now. She needed me to witness this. You know how she is, Dad. That was when I noticed the door click behind us. A young nurse in scrubs stepped in quietly to check the IV line. She looked to be in her late 20s with dark hair, and when she looked up and caught sight of June's face, her entire expression shifted. There was a sudden flash of personal recognition. "Mrs. Sutton?" she asked softly. June looked up, her face streaked with tears. The young woman's chin trembled. "My name is Mia Calderon," she said, her voice cracking. "You taught me in third grade at Harlow Elementary. I recognized your daughter's name on the chart when she came in." She choked back a sob, completely losing her composure. "I am so sorry. I am just so incredibly sorry." June reached out with her free hand and gripped the young nurse's fingers. You know how she is, Dad? They just stayed like that for a moment. My wife and a woman who had been her 8-year-old student 20 years ago, crying together in that sterile white room. And I stood at the foot of the bed, feeling something massive, cold, and resolute sink deep into my chest, like a heavy stone dropping into still water. I looked back at Beth's arms, at the truth hidden beneath those neat white bandages. I remembered the previous summer. It was a brutal Texas heat wave over 100 degrees, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer over the asphalt. Beth had come over for Sunday dinner wearing a thick, long-sleeved shirt. When June brought it up, Beth just laughed it off and said, "You know me, Dad. I always get cold, easily. This is how she is, Dad." I had just nodded and handed her a glass of iced tea, never pushing any further. Because it was easier not to ask. Because I was tired, it was Sunday, and my daughter was smiling. You know how she is, Dad, and I desperately wanted to believe that smile. My throat tightened completely, and I had to press my fist hard against my sternum, breathing deeply through my nose to bear the crushing weight of the truth I had missed. I refused to break down in this room. Et du stew. When Beth woke up, she was going to need her father standing tall. But God as my witness, standing up, had never cost me so much. When I walked back out to the reception area, Todd Grady was sitting in the waiting room, staring at his phone. He stood up immediately, his face shifting effortlessly back into the worried husband persona he had used out in the parking lot. You see? He was 37, broad-shouldered, and still moved with the easy confidence of a man who had the easy civilian sense of a man who had spent a decade on the police force. He wasn't in uniform tonight. He wore civilian clothes, a dark jacket, and jeans. He looked exactly like someone who had dressed up for a specific role. "Earl," he said, walking toward me and extending a hand. "I'm so glad you guys made it. The doctor says she's going to pull through. I just want you to know that whatever you need, whatever June needs, I'm right here." "Sit down, Todd," I said. I used the exact tone I used to use on students who tried to bluff their way through a lesson they hadn't studied. Flat, quiet, devoid of anger. True anger was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. Sit down and do not speak to me. He stopped in his tracks, his hand dropping back to his side. His eyes flickered. Not with hurt or surprise, but with a rapid, calculated reassessment. It was the look of a man adjusting his strategy the second his first plan failed. He sat back down. I turned away and scanned the room. Lucas was tucked into the furthest corner. You know how she is, Dad, curled up on a plastic chair with his knees pulled tight against his chest. You know how she is, Dad. He was still wearing his pajamas, the blue set with the faded NASA logo that June had bought him for Christmas last year. His feet were bare, his eyes were bloodshot and swollen, and he was staring blankly at the floor with the deep, hollow exhaustion of a child who had been terrified for far too long. It broke me completely. I walked across the room, sat down right beside him, and cleared my throat, staying silent at first. I just placed my hand on his shoulder, steady and solid, providing a solid anchor. How she is, Dad. The moment my fingers touched him, he flinched violently, his entire frame shuddering. You know how she is, Dad. That single flinch told me more about the reality of that household than anything anyone else had said all night. After a long moment, Lucas turned his head to look at me. His lower lip was trembling so hard he had to bite down on it to keep control. Grandpa, he whispered, is Mom going to die? No, I told him immediately without a single hesitation or sugar-coated phrase. There are times when a child doesn't need gentle nuance. They need absolute certainty. And this was one of those times. She is not going to die. She is going to wake up. She is going to be incredibly sore, and she is going to complain about how awful the hospital coffee tastes. You know how she is, Dad, and when she does, we are all going to be right here with her. Lucas's face crumpled. He buried his forehead into my shoulder and just wept. It was the deep, agonizing cry of a 12-year-old boy who had held everything inside until he finally couldn't carry it anymore, his body shaking with heavy, ragged breaths. You know how she is, Dad. I wrapped my arms around him, holding him tight, letting him release it all because he desperately needed to. He had been holding his breath since before he even picked up the phone. As the storm of tears slowly began to pass, tapering off into quiet hitches, I kept my arm around him. Lucas, I need to ask you something, I said gently, and I need you to understand that you are not in trouble. Not even a little bit. Do you hear me? He gave a small nod against my shoulder. Tonight, when you called me. Was that the first time you tried to call for help? He stayed quiet for. Back slightly to look at me, and the extrexment use caught the moment. And the expression nothing his face made my chest ache, in a way that had nothing to do with physical pain. I picked up the phone 3 times before I actually called you, he whispered, his voice barely audible, and I put it back down 3 times. Dad told me, he said, if I ever called anyone, they would come and take me away. Put me in foster care. He said, when you call 911, the people who show up tear families apart. You know how she is, Dad. He said it was always better to keep things inside the house. He swallowed about it. Fresh girds, Dad. School hard, fighting back fresh tears. But then Mom stopped making any sounds at all, and I got so scared. I thought if something happened to her, and I didn't call, I would never... I couldn't live with it. Lucas, I said, taking his face in both of my hands the exact way his mother used to do when she wanted to make sure he was truly listening. You know how she is, Dad. Tonight you saved her. Do you understand what I'm telling you? You saved what I'm telling you. You saved your mom's life. Everything else, the things that matters now, the things that scared you, none of that matters now. You picked up that phone and you saved her. His jaw trembled again and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks. But this time he didn't try to hide them. "Grandpa," he said, his voice dropping to a small, ashamed whisper that made me want to slam my fist through the drywall. "Dad said it was my fault. He said if I hadn't made Mom mad during dinner, she wouldn't have fallen." In that exact moment, the rage that washed through me was cold, pure, and entirely silent. It wasn't a reckless, hot anger. It was the freezing, calculated fury of a man who had just looked directly at something incredibly sinister. "You know how he is, Dad." My body needed a second to process the sheer weight of it before I could even speak. I breathed in deeply, then out, keeping my hands perfectly steady against my grandson's face. "You know how she is, Dad." "That is a lie," I said, making sure every syllable was crystal clear and absolute. "What happened to your mom was not your fault. It has never been your fault. Not for a single second. I need you to remember that, Lucas. Can you do that for me?" He nodded, his eyes welling up again, and I pulled him back against my shoulder, holding him close. I looked up, glancing across the waiting room, and realized Todd was watching us intently. "You know how she is, Dad." I didn't grant him the satisfaction of eye contact. I just focused on the weight of my grandson in my arms, listening as his breathing gradually returned to a normal rhythm. After a little while, Lucas pulled back and wiped his face with the back of his hand, staring down at his lap. Then, very quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself, he said, "Grandpa, I have some things on my phone. I don't know if it helps. I've been taking pictures of Mom's arms. Whenever I saw the marks, I didn't really know why I was doing it. I just felt like I needed to keep a..." I laughed about it. At my grandson, this 12-year-old boy in NASA pajamas with bare feet and bloodshot eyes, who had stood entirely alone in the dark with his fear. "You know how she is, Dad," and had done the exact thing I spent 35 years teaching teenagers to do. "Tell me all about it tomorrow," I said. "Tonight, you just focus on breathing. You know how she is, Dad?" He nodded and leaned his head back against my shoulder. Just then, the heavy waiting room doors swung open, and Detective Roy Perkins walked in. He was a large, broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, wearing a well-worn sports coat. "You know how she is, Dad," gripping a paper cup of coffee like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "You know how she is, Teed." He carried the distinct exhaustion of a man who had already pulled a double shift, but knew his night was far from over. "He can know how she is, Dad." He clearly understood exactly what had happened in this room, and he was carefully weighing how much of the truth he could actually share. His eyes locked onto Todd first, then shifted over to me. Then he gave a slight, subtle tilt of his head toward the back hallway. "For corridor outside she is, Dad," demanded. The corridor out's family waiting area was long, washed in harsh fluorescent light, and smelled of industrial cleaner mixed with stale coffee. Detective Roy Perkins walked me all the way to the far end of the hall, before he finally stopped near a supply closet. "You know how she is, Dad." He leaned his back against the wall, cupping his coffee in both hands as if it were the only source of warmth in the entire building. Up close, "You know how she is, Dad." He looked even worse than he had across the room. His skin was a dull gray, and the dark circles under his eyes spoke of a man who had carried heavy burdens for far too long and had finally run out of places to put them down. He looked at me in silence for a few seconds before he spoke. "Mr. Sutton, I'm about to tell you some things that I probably shouldn't," he said, his voice low. You know how she is, Dad. But I need you to promise me that when I'm done, you aren't going to walk back into that room and do something neither of us can fix. I taught high school for 35 years, I replied, keeping my voice level. I know how to listen. You know how she is, Dad. He let out a long, heavy breath through his nose. My name is Roy Perkins, he said. I'm a detective with the Harlow County Sheriff's Department. I was how she is, Dad. I was assigned to your daughter's case tonight. He paused, looking down at his coffee before meeting my eyes again. You know how she is, Dad, and I've already reviewed the other 3 reports from earlier this year. And right then, my stomach dropped through the floor. 3 reports? I asked. 3 domestic dispute calls over the last 18 months. His jaw tightened. 14 months ago, a neighbor complaint, logged, reviewed, and closed. 8 months ago, an ER visit. Beth was admitted for a fractured wrist. She claimed she tripped on the back steps, recorded as an accidental injury. You know how she is, Dad. No follow-up was ever scheduled. He looked down at his coffee. Stance. 6 months ago, someone from your daughter's church requested a wellness check. Deputies went out, spoke to both parties, and logged no immediate danger. Case closed. You know how she is, Dad. The rage that built in my chest was immense and entirely silent. It wasn't the kind of anger that roared. It was the kind that just expanded. You know how she is, Dad, filling every available space until there was no room left for anything else. Who closed them? I asked. Perkins' jaw twitched. Sergeant Dale Briggs, Todd's direct supervisor. They've been on the force together for 9 years. They coach the same youth football league. He finally looked up at me. Mr. Sutton, I want to be straight with you because I think you deserve it. If I write tonight's report and send it up the ladder, it lands right on Dale Briggs's desk, and it'll get closed out just like the others. That's what you're up against. So, what you're telling me, I said, my voice sounding so calm and steady it surprised, even me, is that this has happened 3 times before, people knew, and nothing was done. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Perkins spoke with a distinct trace of shame. His gaze was low, his jaw set. The specific shame of a man watching a machine fail, telling himself he is too small to change a thing. I am sorry, I truly am. You know how she is, Dad. But if you try to make a big noise through official county channels, they already have the narrative built for you. The grieving father, a complicated family dynamic, nothing to see here. He swallowed hard. I can't help you the way you need to be helped. I need you to understand that. I stared at the wall above his head for a moment, not because I needed to think. I had already reasoned through it, from the parking lot to this hallway, and arrived at a clear, cold, and absolute decision. I looked at the wall because I needed 1 second before I said out loud what I had already decided. Roy, I said. Using his first name caught him off guard, and he looked up. You called me out here. You didn't have to do that. You could have given me the official line, sent me home, closed the case, and gone back to your coffee. I held his eyes. Why didn't you? His Adam's apple bobbed. He pressed his lips together, and for a fraction of a second, something raw and genuine flashed across his face. Not the guarded professional mask he had been wearing, but then how she is, Dad. But the thing beneath it, the thing that had been suppressed for 18 months and was finally looking for a way out. Because 3 reports got buried, he said. You know how she is, Dad, and your daughter is lying in that room. I have a daughter. She's 9. She's 9. His voice broke on the number, and it didn't completely recover. She's 9, and she still thinks I can fix everything. You know how she is, Dad, but there's going to come a day when she realizes I can't. I want I need to be able to look at her and know that I did the right thing when it counted, even if it's just this much. He held up his thumb and forefinger a centimeter apart. Even if it's just this little bit. I nodded. I reached out. He took my hand, a firm, brief shake, the grip of two men who understood each other without needing any more words. "Thank you, Roy," I said. "Don't thank me." He pulled his hand back. "Go be with your daughter." I walked back into the waiting room. Through the glass window, in the door, I could see Todd still sitting in his chair, phone in hand, his thumb sliding across the screen. June hadn't come back out yet. She was still with Beth. Lucas was fast asleep in the corner chair. His head leaned awkwardly against the wall, his bare feet tucked up underneath him. "You know how she is, Dad." I pushed the door open, walked right past Todd without a single glance, and took the chair next to Lucas. "You know how she jacket pocket and pulled out the small notebook I had carried every single day for 35 years. I turned to a fresh page. At the very top, I wrote a single word, Todd. Beneath it, the date. Beneath that, 3 prior reports. Sergeant Dale Briggs closed every time. "You know how she is, Dad." Forced together, 9 years, youth football. Beneath that, 48 injuries. Dr. Holt pattern, intentional repeated long term. I kept writing for 20 minutes straight. Everything Perkins had told me, every word Dr. Holt had said, everything I had observed about Todd in the parking lot. The hands in the pockets, the practiced expression. "You know how she is, Dad," the small wave meant for an audience. "You know how she is, Dad." When I finished, I looked at what I had recorded. It was only a single page. It was just the beginning. But I had started enough things in my life to know that every single thing that mattered began exactly this way. A page full of names, facts, and questions. "You know how she is, Dad," and what comes next is always the same. You pull the first thread. Slowly, you let the truth tell you where it wants to be unraveled. The kitchen looked exactly the same as always. And it felt like an accusation. The yellow curtains June had hung 15 years ago were still right where they belonged. The blue ceramic rooster from the San Marcos flea market was still sitting on the counter. I always thought it was hideous, but never said a word. The small crack. "You know how she is, Dad." The small crack in the bottom left corner of the window over the sink was still there, the one I had been meaning to fix with caulk since last spring. Everything was in its place. "You know the who she is, Dad." Everything was as ordinary as it had ever been. And 2 miles north, my daughter was lying in a hospital bed with 48 documented injuries. "You know how she is, Dad," and my wife was asleep in a vinyl chair beside her. "You know how she is, Dad." I had driven home at 6 in the morning to feed the dog, change my shirt, and give my hands something to do, other than sit in a plastic chair and stare at a monitor. Walter, our 12-year-old beagle who Beth had given us when she moved out, was waiting at the back door. "You know how she is, Dad." He looked at me with that patient, slightly reproachful expression unique to an animal who had spent the night alone and wanted an explanation. I fed him. He finished eating, laughed about it. You know now's, Dad. Went back to his bed in the corner and watched me with those old brown eyes while I stood in the middle of the kitchen, trying to remember what came next. "You know how she is, Dad." I sat down at the table and opened the notebook. Todd, still at the top of the page. The word was still at the top of the exactly as I had written it at 4 a.m. in the hospital waiting room. I stared at it for a long time, looking at the letters. How she is, looking at the name I had once written in the new family member section of my grandson's baby book. "You know how she is, Dad." The name June and I had practiced saying out loud so it would sound natural at the wedding. Todd and Beth. Beth and Todd. We wanted everything to be right. I flipped to the back half of the notebook where the old entries lived. I found the page from 14 months ago. The entry read, "Called Beth Sunday. Sounded tired. Said everything is fine. Stress. I believed her. I believed her." I took the pencil and slowly drew a line beneath those 3 words. It was the line a man draws when he is marking something that needs close inspection. The line I had drawn 10,000 times over 35 years of teaching. Whenever a student's paper had an assertion that didn't quite line up with the evidence, I had taught those kids. History belongs to the people who write things down, record the truth, date it. Don't let the story slip away from you. He'd laughed about it. And there I was, listening to my own daughter's tired voice on the phone, letting the story slip right through my fingers. At 7:15, there was a knock at the front door. I opened it to find Reverend Eugene Carr standing on the porch. "You know how she is, Dad." He was a tall man in his late 60s with short, cropped white hair and a face that looked as though it had absorbed the grief of too many people over the decades without flinching. He held his hat in both hands. Dad held his hat in both hands, turning it slowly by the brim, looking like a man who had stayed up all night, rehearsing what he wanted to say, and still wasn't sure if it was enough. "Earl," he said, "I heard. I'm sorry I didn't call first. I just had to come." "Come on in, Eugene," I said. "There's coffee." We sat down at the kitchen table. Eugene held his mug in both hands, staring into it for a moment before he spoke. "I owe you something," he said. "I've owed it to you for 11 months, and I've been a coward about it. I don't want to be a coward anymore." He looked up. "You know how she is, Dad?" His eyes were bloodshot from a lack of sleep, carrying the specific pain of a man who was living with a choice he should have made differently. 11 months ago, Beth came to see me. She sat in my office and didn't say a single word for nearly 10 minutes, just sat there with her hands in her lap. His voice tightened. Then she stood up and said, "It's okay, Pastor. I'm fine." And I just let her walk right out that door. The words settled into the kitchen, heavy and wide, like a stone dropped into water. "Eugene," I said carefully. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I should have called you 11 months ago," he said, his voice cracked then sharply and suddenly on the last word. "I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself she hadn't actually said anything. I told myself, Lord forgive me. I told myself Todd was a police officer, and if something was really wrong, the people with authority would know." He pressed his lips together hard, would know. 3 reports were together, Earl. I just found out filed this morning. 3 reports. 3 reports, and nothing happened. "You know how she is, Dad?" And there I was sitting in my church, telling myself the people with authority would handle it. "You couldn't have known about the reports," I said. "No, but I knew about the 10 minutes of silence." He met my eyes, and I let her walk away. Walter walked over from his corner and rested his gray muzzle on Eugene's knee, the way dogs do when they sense someone in the room is trying to untangle an emotion. "You know how she is, Dad." Eugene placed his hand on the dog's head and took a deep breath. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "Anything, whatever I can. I do need something. I need to go talk to someone," I said. "A woman named Delia Santos. She lives right next door to Beth and Todd. Do you know her, Pastor Carr?" Eugene's expression shifted. "Delia Santos comes to First Methodist every 3rd Sunday, sits in the back row, never stays for fellowship hour." He looked at me intently. "She's terrified, Earl." "I know," I said. "You know how she is, Dad, but I think she's been waiting for someone to ask the right questions." I stood up and moved toward the counter for my jacket. "I think a lot of people have been waiting. You know how she is, Dad." Eugene set his mug down and stood, I'll call her. I'll tell her you're coming over." He paused at the kitchen door, hat back in hand. "Earl, what are you planning to do?" I picked up the notebook from the table. I looked at that single word at the top of the first page. Todd. And the dates, the facts, the beginning of everything I couldn't name yet underneath it. "I'm going to record the truth," I said, just like I always taught my kids to do. Eugene gave a heavy, certain nod, the slow nod of a man who had just found what he was looking for. "You know how she is, Dad." He put his hat on and walked out the front door, and I followed him out into the cold November morning, notebook in my pocket, keys in my hand. Beth and Todd's neighborhood was a 15-minute drive from our house, a grid of modest ranch homes in the southeast section of Harlow. You know how she is, Dad. The kind of street where people hung American flags for the 4th of July, kept their garage doors open on Saturday mornings, and knew the names of the neighbors' dogs. You know how she is, Dad. The kind of street where you'd never suspect the thing I was looking for could exist. I had driven past their house 100 times. You know how she is, Dad. Pulled into their driveway for Sunday dinners, holiday visits, and Lucas's birthday parties. You know how she is, Dad. Walk through their front door carrying casseroles and wrapped gifts with all the ordinary baggage of a family that thought everything was fine. I pulled up to the curb across the street and sat in the car, looking at the house for a moment. The blinds were drawn, and Todd's patrol car wasn't there. I figured he was at the station, doing whatever a man does the morning after a man like him does the morning after his wife is admitted to the hospital with 48 distinct injuries. The yard was neatly kept. The flower beds lining the front walkway were sharply edged, and an autumn leaf wreath hung from the front door. Something Beth probably made herself. He was a software he made herself. From the outside, it perfectly matched what it was supposed to be. I got out of the car and walked toward the house next door. Delia Santos opened the door on the very first knock. You know how she is, which Eugene had already called ahead. She was a petite woman in her late 60s with graying hair pulled back and a pair of deep, you know how she is, cautious eyes that took me in from Fred to toe from stepped aside. "Mr. Sutton," she said, "please come in." Her kitchen was warm, smelling of cinnamon and strong coffee. She poured a cup without asking, set it in front of me, and sat down across the table, cupping her mug in both hands, her eyes fixed directly on mine. "How is Beth?" she asked. "Stable," I said. "She hasn't woken up yet." "You know how she is." Delia closed her eyes for a brief second, her jaw tightening. Then she opened them and looked straight at me. "What do you need to know?" "Everything you saw," I said. "Everything you heard. Start wherever you think it begins." She took a deep breath. And then she started. "The first year they moved in," she said, "after that big windstorm in February, Todd came over and fixed my fence. Didn't ask for money, didn't wait for me to bring it up. Just showed up with his tools on a Saturday morning and spent 4 hours out there." She looked down at her coffee. "He used to bring Beth flowers every Friday. He'd laughed about it. I'd watch him pull up in his patrol car with a bundle from the gas station, usually daisies, sometimes carnations. He'd walk through the front door, and 20 minutes later, you know how she is, Dad, I could hear Beth laughing about something." Her voice dropped an octave. Then it stopped. I know exactly when it stopped. It was the second week after he got demoted. "Tell me about the shift," I said. "You know how she is, Dad," my pencil scratching against the notebook. "It wasn't a sudden change. It was gradual, like turning down a dimmer switch." "You know how she is, Dad." She set her mug down and placed her hands flat on the table, steadying herself. "At first, it was just noise. You know how she is, Dad. Late at night, the sound of his voice getting loud. I told myself they were having an argument, and couples argue. Then, one morning, you know how she is, Dad, I saw Beth out in the driveway wearing a long-sleeved shirt. In July in Texas, Mr. Sutton, it was 104 degrees. She waved and smiled at me. You know how she is, Dad, then went back inside before I could say a word. Delia's eyes filled with moisture. She pressed her lips tight, refusing to let the tears fall. I should have walked over. I should have knocked on that door. I should have knocked on that door. Why didn't you? I asked. It wasn't an accusation. I just needed to understand. Delia looked at me with an expression that was a mix of shame and an exhausted, honest block. Because Todd knows everyone on this block. Every neighbor, every barking dog, every person, every who might pick up a phone. He's been the community liaison officer for this district for 6 years. He knows all our names, knows our routines, knows who's home during the day, and who works the night shift. She shook her head slowly. You know how she is, Dad. He made sure we all understood, even without saying it directly, that he was the kind of person you didn't want to make trouble with. And we were all afraid. I'm not proud of it, but it's the truth. You're not afraid now, I said. No, she said, her chin lifting. I don't want to be afraid anymore. What do you need from me, Mr. Sutton? A written statement. I'll give it to you. Put my name on a piece of paper. You take it. Both, I said, and any other details you can remember. Every date, every specific, every single time you heard or saw something that felt wrong, she nodded. Give me your notebook. I slid it across. She took my pencil and began to write in a crisp, precise script that surprised me. He'd laughed about it. When she looked up and caught my expression, a faint, almost bitter smile touched her face. I was an office manager for 22 years, she said. I know how to keep a record. We worked for 40 minutes. Neats. When she pushed the notebook back, it held 4 full pages of her own handwritten testimony, documenting 14 months of what she had witnessed across a 12-foot fence line. I was rereading the entries when she spoke. One more thing before you go. I looked up. Beth gave me something to keep safe, she said. About 3 months ago. A small envelope, she said, and I remember her exact words. Delia, if anything happens to me and my dad comes asking, give him this. I didn't open it, and I didn't ask what was inside. Sup does. You know Shosdyer's, Dad. She stood and walked over the kitchen drawers next to the stove. She came back with a small sealed white envelope with my name written across the front in Beth's handwriting. My throat closed up completely. I stared at the word Dad. I stared at the word Dad written by my daughter's hand, feeling a sudden burning sting behind my eyes. You know how she is, Dad. I had to press my huckle hard against my upper lip, breathing through my nose until the sensation passed. Beth knew. 3 months ago, she knew, and she had left a trail. You know how she is. I was just reaching for the envelope when my phone rang. It was June from the hospital. Earl. Her voice was high and tight, making my heart slam against my ribs. You know how she is. You have to come back right now. You know how she is, Dad. Dr. Holt said someone called the hospital this morning. Someone is trying to change Beth's medical records. I kept my hands tight on the steering wheel as I drove back to Harlow Regional, the unopened envelope resting in my jacket pocket. June met me by the second-floor elevators. She was wearing the same clothes from the night before, her white hair uncombed, carrying that distinct hollow look unique to someone who hasn't slept. You know how she is, Dad, worn thin from carrying a weight she never should have had to bear. She grabbed my arm the second the doors slid open. She's at the end of the hall, June said, meaning Dr. Holt. She's been waiting for you, Earl. How she is, Dad. Someone called the chief hospital administrator this morning. They want to amend the report on Beth's injuries. Amend it to what? I asked as we walked. Accidental trauma. June's voice broke on the second word. They want to say she fell, that it was just an isolated incident. One fall, one night, nothing before that. You know how she is, Dad. The anger that moved through me was so complete and so cold that it felt almost like calm. Almost. Dr. Holt was standing outside the door of an office at the end of the administrative corridor. When she saw me coming, she pushed the door open and stepped back without a word. June followed us inside. Dr. Holt locked the door behind us. The soft, deliberate click exactly how compromised she felt. She stood behind the desk, her hands pressed flat against the wood surface, looking at me with the same tired, angry eyes. At 8:45 this morning, she said, 45 this morning, she said, I received a phone call from Glenn Marsh, the chief administrator. You know how she is, Dad. He informed me that a complaint had been filed against my medical license with the Texas Medical Board. An anonymous complaint. You know how she is, Dad, alleging clinical negligence and improper documentation. Her voice remained steady, but her hands were visibly shaking against the desk. I have been practicing for 17 years. I have never had a single complaint. Not one. In exchange for changing the report, I said, the complaint goes away. That was the subtext. She drew herself up. He didn't say it in those exact words. He just suggested that I re-review my notes to ensure they reflected the most accurate clinical picture. Her jaw tightened. I know what that means. Did you change anything? I asked. No. Short, sharp. And I absolutely will not. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. But I want you to see what I did this morning before anyone had a chance to lean on me. She opened the folder and laid 3 documents on the desk in front of me. You know how she is, Dad. First, I personally filed a complete confidential report with the Texas Medical Board through their independent reporting system, including my original findings, full imaging analysis, and a written timeline of the events. That report now lives in a system Glenn Marsh cannot access and Todd Grady cannot touch. I looked at the documents, the tightness in my chest easing a fraction. Second, she continued, our hospital uses an electronic health record system. Every single modification made to a patient file is automatically logged. Timestamp, user ID, and the IP address of the workstation that initiated the request. The screen showed an audit log with 2 entries highlighted in yellow. You know how she is, Dad. The request to modify Beth's file was made this morning at 8:17 a.m., exactly 13 minutes before Glenn Marsh called me. She pointed to the IP address column. That workstation does not belong to this hospital. I leaned forward, reading the address notation next to the highlighted entries. That's the IP address for the Harlow County Sheriff's Department, I said. Yes, Dr. Holt said. It is. Behind me, June let out a sharp sound. Not a word, just a sound. The noise of a reality finally snapping into place. Without turning around, I reached back and caught her hand. Dr. Holt, I said, I'm going to need your permission to use this documentation. All of it. She closed the laptop. You know how she is, Dad. She stood perfectly straight behind her desk, and for a second she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who was frightened and exhausted. How she is, Dad. But entirely certain of what she was about to say next. Take it, she said. Every single piece of it. I didn't go to medical school to let someone erase what was done to that woman. She paused. Mr. Sutton, let me know when she wakes up. You'll be my second call, I told her. Her jaw trembled quickly once, then steadied. I recorded Dr. Holt's name in my notebook. IP address, timestamps, audit logs, Glenn Marsh's name. Beneath it, I wrote a single line. Sheriff's Department workstation attempted to alter victim's medical file. 8:17 a.m. Then I walked out to the parking lot, poursuivre, sat my car, and finally opened Beth's envelope. Inside were 23 small slips of paper torn from a notepad, written in pencil, the script so faint I had to angle them toward the window light to read them. Each slip had a date at the top. Beneath the date were short, specific, almost clinical descriptions, the kind of recording people do only when they are documenting something too painful to feel. March 4th, left forearm, kitchen. April 19th, right ribs, claimed slipped in shower. June 2nd, left cheek, wore sunglasses to Lucas's end-of-year school concert. 23 entries spanning 14 months. At the bottom of the very last page, the handwriting was smaller, as if she were running out of room and trying to squeeze it all in. If anything happens to me. I love you, Dad. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. The November sun hit the pages in my hand at a low angle, and I read every single entry twice without crying. I had made my decision on the drive over, and I held onto it like the only thing keeping me upright. Then I carefully placed the papers back into the envelope, tucked it inside my notebook, and started the car. Over the last 24 hours, the kitchen table had transformed. It used to be the place where June and I graded papers after dinner, where we paid bills on Sunday mornings, where Lucas did his homework while Walter snoozed under his chair. Now, it was covered in documentation. My notebook was open to page 6. Dr. Holt's photocopied audit logs. Delia Santos's photocopied audit logs. Delia 4 pages of handwritten testimony, and Beth's envelope resting right in the middle, acting as the axis around which everything else turned. I sat down and looked at it all, not knowing what to do next for 47 seconds. Then I walked over to the desk in the hallway, pulled open the deep bottom drawer I almost never used, and dug through old tax returns, a broken stapler, and a birthday card from 2019 until I found from 2019 and I found I was looking for. A small address book with a burgundy leather cover, its pages soft from years of handling. You know how she is, Dad. Every entry inside was written in my own hand. I hadn't looked at it in 3 years. I found the name on page 7. Marvin Cross. Marvin and I had known each other for 30 years. The kind of connection that forms when two men work in the same small town long enough for their lives to intertwine in a dozen small ways. You know how she is, Dad. His kids had been in my history classes. We had coached opposing teams in the Harlow Church Softball League for the last 6 summers. You know how she is, Dad. We had crossed paths in every hardware store and diner within a 20-mile radius for 3 decades. He had retired 4 years ago, after serving 11 years as the Harlow County Sheriff. He was 68 now, moved a bit slower than he used to, that he tended with the same methodical care he used to run law enforcement. The phone rang twice before he picked up. "Earl Sutton," he said, his voice deep and unhurried. The voice of a man who had spent decades listening to people speak during their worst moments and knew that the speed of delivery mattered just as much as the content. "It's been a while. 3 years and 4 months, I said. After a brief pause, he spoke with the warmth of a friend who remembers Brunel's details precisely. "You always did love exact numbers." Another, shorter, pause followed. I heard about Beth. Word travels fast in a town this size. I thought about calling June this morning, so I didn't. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry. That was wrong of me, and I'm sorry. Marvin, I said, I need to talk to you and not over the phone. Can I come over? I'll put the coffee on, he said. Marvin Cross lived in a brick ranch home in North Harlow with a wide front porch and a garden that took up most of his backyard. He'd laughed about it. He met me at the door holding 2 mugs, handing me one without a word. The silent shorthand of 2 men who knew each other well enough to skip the hollow pleasantries. He led me to the kitchen table, sat down across from me, laced his fingers together, and waited for me to begin. You know how she is, Dad. I laid everything out on the table. The 48 documented injuries, Detective Perkins' confession about the 3 buried reports, and the fact that Sergeant Dale Briggs had closed every single case. Talked about it. You know how she is, Dad. I pointed to the IP address from the Sheriff's Department workstation found in Beth's medical file, Delia Sansas's written testimony, Beth's 23 handwritten notes, and Dr. Holt's official independent report to the Texas Medical Board. Marvin listened the exact way he always did back on the force. He sat perfectly still, leaving his aunt's coffee completely untouched, keeping his eyes locked onto me. He didn't interrupt a single time. When I finally finished speaking, he picked up his mug, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down. Dale Briggs, he said, his voice flat. I hired him back in 2003. He was a good officer back then. He'd Yuzu's dad. His jaw tightened. But people change when they believe absolutely no one is watching them. Can you bypass the internal department channels? I asked. No. His answer was direct and immediate, carrying the exact same weight as Dr. Holt's. Not as long as Dale is running the domestic division and not while Todd has those internal connections. He looked at me steadily. You know how she is, Dad, but Earl, I served as the Harlow County Sheriff for 11 years. I didn't leave that office empty-handed. He stood up. You know how she is, Dad. Walked over to a drawer by the counter, the kind of drawer where people keep the important things they don't want officially filed away. He returned with a small spiral notebook and a pen, sitting back down across from me. Captain Diane Flores, he said as he wrote the name down. Texas Rangers, Company D, San Antonio. She served under me from 1998 to 2004 before she moved up the ranks. He tore the page out and slid it across the table. You know how she is, Dad. The Rangers operate entirely independent of the county sheriff's office, he explained. A completely separate chain of command, separate jurisdiction. You know how she is, Dad. If Diane opens an investigation, Dale Briggs can't touch it. He can't slow it down, and he can't make a single phone call that will protect anyone. He looked me dead in the eye. But Earl, the moment I call her, this machine starts moving, and it will not stop. Do you understand what that means? I looked at the name on the paper. My own notebook. Then looked, staring at the word Todd at the top of the first page, followed by 14 pages of documented facts. Make the call, Marvin, I said. He nodded, reached for his phone, and dialed the number completely from memory, without even glancing at the paper. I suppose some numbers are kept in places far deeper than a kitchen drawer. He stayed on the phone for 11 minutes. I sat there sipping my coffee, watching the November garden through the kitchen window. You know how she is, Dad. The last few tomato cages were still standing in the bare dirt, and the pecan tree by the back fence was shedding its final leaves into the cold afternoon air. You know how she is, Dad. When he finally hung up, he set his phone down carefully. Diane will meet with you. he said. "The day after tomorrow in San Antonio." He paused for a moment. "She said to bring everything you have." As I was writing the appointment down in my notebook, my phone vibrated on the table. It was June. Earl, her voice sounded sharp and thin, making my heart sink instantly. "Todd just called me. He said he wants to take Lucas home tonight. Back to his house." I set my pencil down on the table with absolute care. "Tell him," I said, keeping my voice entirely level, "that Lucas is staying with us. June, do not argue with him. Just tell him that, and hang up the phone." There was a long silence on the line. Then she asked, "Earl, what are you going to do?" "I am going to make sure," I said. "You know how she is, Dad, that Lucas never has to walk back into that house again." Before I share the secret, my 12-year-old grandson managed to hide on his phone for 8 months. Please drop a comment saying "still listening" to let me know you are right here with me on this journey. As a quick reminder, this next part includes "with me on this journey" to help tell structured elements, but the feature behind it is entirely real. If this kind of story makes if this perfectly makes you uncomfortable, now is a perfectly fine time to step away. I completely understand. June didn't just hang up on Todd. She cut the call off before he could even finish his sentence. That action spoke volumes about her state of mind. I drove back to the hospital, keeping the note Marvin gave me folded securely in my shirt pocket. My chest still felt tight, but it wasn't from fear. It was the clear realization that the next few hours were going to be far more critical than the ones behind us. Lucas was still at the hospital. Lucas was still there all day, feeding him sandwiches from the vending machine and letting him sit right by Beth's side. How she is. He had been holding her hand, talking to her about his baseball team, his math homework, and all the things a 12-year-old child talks about when he desperately needs to believe that his voice still matters. I found them both in Beth's room. Ooh. June was sitting in the chair to the left of the bed, while Lucas was curled up in the visitor's chair on the right, resting his hands over Beth's bandaged arm. "You know how she is, Dad." He was telling her about a new season of a video game he liked. His voice, "She is, Dad." His voice carrying a forced brightness. The sound of a young boy trying with everything he had to make the adults around him feel like things were normal. He looked up when he saw me as Dad. He looked up when he saw me walk in. That brightness vanished for a second, revealing the exhaustion underneath before he masked it again. "Hey, Grandpa," he said. "Hey, buddy," I said, taking a seat by the window. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," he said, looking back at Beth. "I'm just telling Mom about the game. She used to say I talked too much about it, but she used to say I'd tell me to shut up right now. But I guess she can't really tell me to shut up right now." He shrugged, trying to act completely unfazed, and he almost pulled it off. June looked at me across her mouth wouldn't form. I gave her a small, tight nod. Marvin took care of it. "We have a way forward." She closed her eyes for 2 full seconds, letting out a heavy, barely visible sigh of relief before looking back at me. "Lucas," I said gently, "I need to ask you something. You know how she is, Dad, and I need you to know that no matter what the answer is, you aren't in any trouble. Not with me, and not with anyone else. Do you understand?" He turned completely around in his chair to face me. "Yeah," he said, "I understand. You know how she is, Dad. The other night in the waiting room, you told me you had some things on your phone. Pictures of your mom's arms." I kept my tone soft and steady, the exact way I used to talk to students who were finally ready to share a secret they had been keeping inside. "Do you still have them?" Lucas went entirely still. "You know how she is, Dad." He looked down at Beth's hand for a moment, his jaw twitching. "You know how she is, Dad," before reaching deep into the pocket of his hoodie. The same NASA sweatshirt from the night before that June must have brought from home. He pulled out a phone. It was an older model with a distinct crack running across the bottom right corner of the screen. He handed it to me without saying a single word. I took it carefully. "Is it okay if I look?" He just nodded. I unlocked the screen and opened the photo album. The most recent pictures were from the night everything happened. They were dark and slightly blurry, the clear work of a terrified child who didn't know what else to do. I kept scrolling backward, further and further. There were 17 photos in total. The earliest one was dated March 9th, 8 months ago. Every single picture captured a clear shot of Beth's forearms, her shoulders, or the side of her face, and every single file contained the automatically generated date and timestamp in the metadata. Over those 8 months, the injuries shifted locations. Different spots, different stages of healing, a systematic record of what had been happening in that house. My throat tightened up, My throat tightened up completely. I'll look up at the ceiling tiles and breathe through my nose for 10 seconds before I could trust my own voice to speak. "Lucas," I said, setting the phone down and looking at my grandson. He was watching me with wide, anxious eyes, waiting to hear if he had done something wrong. "How did you know to take these?" His chin started to tremble. I didn't really know," he whispered. The first time I saw the marks, I thought someone should know about it. But I couldn't tell anyone, because Dad said, he told me if I ever told anyone what happened inside the house, the government would come and separate us. Put me in a shelter. His voice dropped to a tiny, ashamed whisper. I believed him for a really long time. But I kept taking the pictures anyway because I thought maybe one day I could show them to someone who could help. The cold, fueled fury toward Todd Grady that had been building in my chest flared up so intensely that I had to bite down on my back teeth to keep it under control. "You did the exact right thing," I told him. "With every single one of these pictures, you did perfectly." "Are they going to help?" he asked. "I mean, can they help Mom?" "Yes," I said. "Lucas, they are going to help more than you could ever know." He pressed his lips together hard, his eyes filling with tears that he refused to let fall. He was holding it back with that rigid restraint common to a child who had learned that crying at home was dangerous and hadn't forgotten the lesson. That detail cut deeper than anything else. "Come here," I said. He stood up from his chair and walked over to my side. I reached out and wrapped my arms around him. This skinny, 12-year-old boy who had carried a cracked phone and a massive secret for 8 months. I held him tight, and slowly he finally let his weight lean completely into me. Across the bed, June watched us, her hand pressed over her mouth as her shoulders shook. "You know how she is, Dad." Later that evening at home, after Lucas had fallen asleep on the couch with Walter curled up at his feet, June sat at the kitchen table watching me transfer those 17 photos from the phone onto a flash drive. She had figured out the cloud backup. She wore her reading glasses. It was on. Opening the application on her phone with her lips pressed into a thin line. Expression I recognized from 38 years of marriage as her way of handling a difficult task while refusing to admit it was hard. "All done," she said once the transfer finished. She set her phone down and removed her glasses, looking up at me. "What happens now?" "Now I call Marvin," I said, "and tell him we have 17 time-stamped photos spanning 8 months. I picked up the flash drive, turning it over in my hand, and tomorrow morning we drive to San Antonio." June reached across the table, covering my hand, the flash drive, and my fist with her own. She gripped it tightly. Earl, I spent 30 years teaching first graders how to read, she said, her voice completely steady despite the tears she refused to let fall. I can handle a digital backup. For the first time in 2 days of an absolute nightmare, a faint trace of a smile passed between us. It was brief, but it was real, and it was ours. Right now, that was everything. The house was completely silent. Thought about it. Past midnight, everyone who was supposed to be asleep was resting with only one exception. Lucas was on the couch, sapat, tucked under the blue blanket. June had knitted during the winter. She broke her wrist and needed something to keep her hands busy. Walter was resting against the back of his knees, the old dogs breathing slow and even. June had finally gone upstairs at 11. You know how she is, Dad. After I told her 3 separate times that I was fine and would be up shortly, she gave me that look she's used for 38 years. The one that meant she knew I wasn't fine and had absolutely no intention of going to bed. You know how she is, Dad. She kissed my cheek and went upstairs anyway, understanding that some things a man has to face entirely alone. Beth's spiral notebook was sitting on the table in front of me. Not the 23 loose pages from the envelope. Those were neatly folded back into my jacket pocket. This was her actual journal, the cheap 89-cent kind you find in the school supply aisle. June had found it in her purse when the nurse handed over Beth's personal belongings. When we got home, you know how she is, Dad. June had set it on the kitchen table without a word, and neither of us had opened it. How's is, Dad? Now it was midnight, I was alone, and I couldn't find a single reason left not to look. I turned to the very first page. It was Beth's handwriting. The script I had known since she was 7 years old. I had watched it evolve from the shaky block letters of first grade to the cursive loops of high school, and now to this, the tight, puffed script of an adult woman who no longer had the time to draw elegant curves. The first entry was written 16 months ago. I don't want Mom and Dad to worry. That was all. No date. Dafrisen. That was allst. No date. No explanation. No context. You know how she is, Dad. Just those 7 words sitting entirely alone on the first line of the page, like a door she had thought about opening before giving up, but chose to record anyway. My throat tightened completely, and I pressed my knuckles hard against my mouth, sitting there breathing through my nose until the feeling passed. How she is, Dad. I turned the page and kept reading. The early entries were cautious and guarded. You know how she is, Dad. Beth was avoiding the core issue, writing the way a person does when they are still deciding how honest they can afford to be with themselves. You know how she is, Dad. She wrote about Lucas's baseball games, a new recipe she was trying, a coworker she liked, ordinary things. But every few pages, something else would surface. A sentence that didn't fit, a detail that felt wrong, a hint of what she was holding back. Todd was in a mood last night, made sure Lucas stayed in his room, wore the green scarf to church. Eugene said, I looked nice. I'm glad he didn't ask questions, called Mom. She asked if everything was okay. I said yes. She sounded relieved. I'm glad she was relieved. Halfway through the notebook, you know how she is, Dad. I found the entry from 14 months ago, the one that matched the note in my own journal. The day I wrote, called Beth Sunday, sounded tired, said everything is fine. I believed her. Her version read like this: Dad called. He could hear something was wrong. I could tell by the careful way he was asking questions, like he was trying not to startle a witness. I told him it was just stress from work. He said, Okay, sweetheart, you know you can always call. I said, I know, Dad. I love you. You know how she is? I hung up and sat on the kitchen floor for a very long time. I set the notebook down, placing both hands flat on either side of it, and stared at the wall above the refrigerator, taking deep breaths 1, 2, 3, 4 times. The image of my daughter, sitting alone on her kitchen floor after hanging up with me, reconstructed itself in my chest, settling in like a toxin that could never be fully removed. She knew I had noticed. She had deliberately chosen to protect me from knowing the exact truth. I flipped through more pages. As the months went on, the entries became shorter. There was less narrative and more documentation. It seemed she no longer had the energy for full sentences, simply recording the facts, the dates, the locations. You know how she is, Dad, and the brief descriptions. It matched the slips from the envelope almost perfectly. You know how she is, Dad, but there was one detail the envelope didn't include. At the bottom of every single factual entry, a specific sentence was written. Lucas doesn't know. Lucas was at school. Lucas stayed at Connor's house. Thank God. 14 entries in a row ended with some variation of that phrase. My daughter had been lying on her kitchen floor, holding ice to her arm and towels to her face, and her very first thought, every single time, was her son. The tears came without any warning, spilling over completely. Hot moisture ran down my cheeks before I could even decide whether to hold it back, so I just let them fall. There was no one in the room who needed me to be strong right now, and some things deserve a proper cry. I sat there in the middle of the night, weeping for my daughter, for the 14 months of silent suffering she endured to keep everyone else safe, and for every single entry that ended with those 3 words, Lucas doesn't know. When it finally passed, I wiped my face with a dish towel and walked over to the window. You know how she is, Dad. The pecan tree stood perfectly still in the cold night air, its branches completely bare against the dark sky. You know how she is, Dad? I walked back to the table and turned to the final entry Beth had written, just 3 days before she was admitted. I keep thinking about it. If something happens, you know how she is, Dad. I feel like something is coming soon. I can sense it, the way you feel a change in the weather. I want to leave a record somewhere safer than this house. I'm writing it all down. Everything. Somewhere Dad can find it if he needs to. Dad always says, you know how she is, Dad. History belongs to the people who write things down. I remember, Dad. I closed the journal. I opened my own notebook to a fresh page and wrote a single line. Beth knew. She prepared. Now I need to find what she hid. I turned off the kitchen light and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the rhythm of Lucas's breathing and Walter's soft snores. You know how she is, Dad, thinking about my daughter and everything she had carried alone in the dark. Beth's room looked exactly the same the next morning. The monitor showed steady lines. U-mends and the IV stand caught the early morning light coming through the window. You know how she is, Dad. That faint mechanical rhythm was something you learned to ignore after the first hour. But the moment the room went completely quiet, you'd suddenly hear it again. I arrived at 7:15, hours before June, before Lucas, and before the day shift nurses had fully taken over. I wanted an hour alone with my daughter. You know how she is, Dad. The night nurse, a large man named Gerald, who had seen me enough over the last few days to recognize my footsteps in the hall, just waved me in without a word. I pulled the vinyl chair right up to the bedside and sat down. Beth looked as she had yesterday, which the doctors assured us was a good sign. No change meant no decline. No change meant no decline, and no decline meant things were still moving in the right direction. The bruising on her face was shifting from that sickly yellow-green to a darker purple, the standard progression of healing. The bandages on her arms were clean and fresh, changed just the night before. He'd laughed about it. She was breathing steadily on her own, the deep, rhythmic breathing of sleep, a chemically induced rest that her body was using to repair itself. I took her right hand, the one without the bandages, holding it the way I used to when we walked through parking lots together when she was small. I read your notebook last night. I said, keeping my voice soft, using that casual tone you use when you desperately hope the person can hear you. Every single page. I paused for a moment. You wrote that you didn't want Mom and Dad to worry. Beth, you spent 14 months worrying about us while you were the one in danger. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to keep going. You know how she is? That is the most characteristic thing I've ever heard. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the old photograph Delia had found among Beth's things, the one she always kept in her wallet. You know how she is, Dad? It was a picture of Beth at 8 years old, sitting on my shoulders in the backyard, laughing directly at something just out of frame. You know how she is, Dad? Her hands gripping my hair to keep her balance. I hadn't realized she still had it. I hadn't known she carried that piece of us into the life she built away from us. I placed it carefully on the bed rail right next to her hand. You kept this all these years, I whispered, and I never even knew. My phone vibrated in my pocket. A text from Marvin, Flores confirmed. Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. San Antonio. Bring everything. I recorded the appointment in my notebook. Beneath it, I wrote, one more thing needed. Beth prepared something. Find it. That phrase from her journal kept echoing in my head, in a safer place. It wasn't at the house. It wasn't in her purse. It was somewhere she knew would be absolutely secure. Even if Todd searched the house, you know how she is, Dad, even if he went through her belongings. I scanned the room slowly, looking at the chairs, the windowsill, the narrow shelf above the bed where the hospital-issued tissue box and plastic water pitcher sat. Then my eyes drifted to her pillow. It was a tiny detail, a nearly imperceptible unevenness along the bottom edge of the pillowcase. If you weren't actively looking for something that didn't belong there, you would never notice it. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad? I reached out, my hand moving slowly and carefully as I lifted the corner of the pillow. It was that specific hesitation you feel when you are terrified of what you might find. You know how she is, Dad, but even more terrified of finding nothing at all. A small, folded white envelope was pressed flat against the mattress. Written across the front was my name, Dad. It was Beth's handwriting. The same tight, careful script from her journal. My hand, the same to shake so badly, my hand started to shake from her bed rail that I had to my palms flat the envelope down on the bed rail and press my palms flat as my thighs second. I heed to cup its perfamast. Before I could pick it up again, I held it, looking at my unconscious daughter, unconscious Tautar, realizing she had tucked this into the folds of her pillow. Some part of her that was how she is, Dad. Some part of her that was still thinking, still fighting, and still entirely herself, knew it had to be kept in a safe place. The door clicked open. Todd Grady walked into the room holding a bundle of daisies, wrapped in grocery store plastic. Yellow and white, the exact flowers Delia said he used to bring her every Friday. He was in civilian clothes, clean-shaved, with that familiar, worried expression firmly back in place. He looked exactly like a concerned husband checking on his wife, his eyes perfectly fitting the role he was playing for T. On a split second, it was a quick, trained glance, the sharp assessment of a man processing a room. It was a quick assessment of you know how she is, Dad. Then his gaze shifted back to my face, and the worried husband mask was instantly restored. Earl, he said warmly, I'm glad you're here. I wanted to drop by and see her. How she is, Dad. How is she doing? Any updates? I slowly slid the envelope into the inside pocket of my jacket, keeping my eyes locked on him the entire time. You know how she is, Dad. The doctors say she's moving in the right direction, I said. He'd laughed about it. Todd set the daisies down on the windowsill and turned to look at Beth. For a fraction of a second, something genuine flickered across his face. It wasn't part of the act. You know how she is, Dad. It was something buried deep underneath that broke through before he could suppress it. It wasn't quite regret, but something far more complex and fractured. She looks better, he said. Don't you think she looks better, Earl? I said, why don't you sit down with her for a minute? I need to step out and make a quick call. I walked out of the room and down the corridor, never looking back. The hallway outside Beth's room felt 50 feet longer than it had when I walked in. You know how she is, Dad. I walked past the nurse's station where Mia was updating charts, past the family restrooms. You know how she is, Dad, and past the stairwell doors until I reached the large window at the very end of the hall. Outside, the hospital parking lot stretched out beneath a flat Texas sky. You know how she is, Dad. I stood there, with my back to the corridor, resting my hand against the envelope inside my jacket, taking deep breaths. You know how she is, Dad. I counted 23 seconds, then turned around and walked back. Todd was still in the room. Through the glass pane in the door, I could see him sitting in the chair I had just vacated, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He was staring directly at Beth, his phone completely forgotten. His shoulders were hunched inward, his head bowed slightly, looking like a man carrying an incredibly heavy burden he had no idea how to set down. I pushed the door open. He looked up, and his posture shifted instantly. His shoulders squared, and his facial expression reassembled itself. Earl, he said, standing up. You know how she is, Dad. I was thinking maybe we could head downstairs to grab a coffee and talk through things, man. I feel like there's a lot of misunderstanding here, and I'd really appreciate the chance to... You called me Earl, I said, cutting him off. He stopped. What? What? You know how she is, Dad. For the last 9 years, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly calm through every Sunday dinner, every Christmas morning, and every single time Lucas got hurt and you called us. You called me Dad. I looked at him steadily. When exactly did I become Earl? The expression on Todd Grady's face shifted completely, and this time, it wasn't an act. Dashable. The mask slipped entirely, revealing a flash of genuine, broken shame before he desperately tried to regain his footing. His jaw set tightly. You know how she is, Dad? And his eyes dropped to the floor for a second before meeting mine again. I don't know what you want me to say, he muttered. I want you to talk about the flowers, I said. The daisies. You used to bring her flowers every single Friday. Delia Santos told me. Every Friday for the entire first year, and then it just stopped. I kept my voice flat. Thalassa, the exact same level voice I used for 35 years during the hardest conversations with students who didn't want to listen, with parents, with anyone. Where did that Todd go? The man who fixed a neighbor's fence? The man who brought her daisies? Todd's Adam's apple bobbed. You know how she is, Dad. He pressed his lips together so hard they turned white at the edges. His hands at his sides clenched and unclenched. Things change, he said, his voice sounding rough and unfamiliar. You wouldn't understand. Lucas told me you used to coach his little league team, I said. He said you quit 2 years ago. He said your knee hurt. I paused. I don't think it was your knee. I think it was your shame. The color slowly drained from Todd's face like water emptying from a glass. I think you lost the thing that made you feel like yourself. You came home every night not knowing how to exist in your own house. My flat, clear voice didn't shake once. And instead of asking for help, instead of calling someone, talking to someone, doing anything that would actually help you, you took it out on her. My daughter, the person who loved you and chose you, Todd stared at the floor. He stared at the door. His jaw was twitching. His hands at his sides were shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from anger, shame, or something else entirely. You need to leave now, I said. Come back when June is here, when Lucas is here, but right now I am asking you to walk out of this room. He gave me one last look, and in that moment, you know how she is before. He turned and walked out. What I saw on his face wasn't the blank look he usually used to save face. It was a collapse. The look of someone who had tried to pretend to be strong for too long and had finally run completely out of energy. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood in the hallway and let out a long, shaky breath. Then I went back into the room, sat down next to Beth, and took her hand again. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope. Not the one Delia Santos had kept for 3 months. You know how she is, Dad? Not the one with my name on it that I opened in the hospital parking lot yesterday. This was the one from under the pillow. Newer paper, tighter handwriting. Newer paper. The script of someone writing in a hurry, or in pain, or both. 23 pages, matching the dates and injuries from Delia's copies exactly, but with one addition. At the bottom of every single entry, in that small, tight script, it read, Lucas doesn't know. Lucas is at school. Lucas is at Connor's. You know how she is, Dad, and at the very bottom of the last page, sitting on a line all by itself, if anything happens to me. I love you, Dad. 10 minutes later, I called Marvin from the parking lot. The phone rang once, and he picked up. She left a written record, I said. My voice was a lot steadier than I expected it to be. 23 entries, 14 months, dates, injuries, locations, all of it. You know she is, Dad. Marvin was completely silent on the other end for 4 full seconds. Earl, he said, that's the case. That's the whole thing right there. Another pause, and when he spoke again, you know how she is, Dad. His voice was incredibly cautious and deliberate. We need to find out if Beth has anything else. If there are any recordings. Because paper is powerful, but her voice is even more powerful. I looked up at the hospital window, 2nd floor, 3rd from the left, the room where my daughter was moving in the right direction. I'll ask her, I said, when she wakes up. She will, Marvin said, and it wasn't a question. Yes, I said, she will. The drive from Harlow to San Antonio takes 45 minutes on a clear morning, and I used every single one them to think. I had done enough of that at the midnight kitchen table. I used the time to go over the sequence in my head the way I used to review a lesson plan on the drive to school. You know how she is, Dad. What evidence I had, what order to present it in, what I needed her to understand without me having to explain why it mattered. You know how she is, Dad, because when you have to explain why something matters, you've already lost your edge. I brought my notebook. I brought Dr. Holt's audit log, log with the Sheriff's Department IP address. I brought Delia Santos's 4 pages of handwritten testimony. I brought Beth's 23 pages of notes. I brought the flash drive with Lucas' 17 time-stamped photos. I brought Pastor Carr's written stamped photos. Account of the day, Beth walked into his office and walked back out. I had the organized documentation of a retired teacher, chronological, clear, every source identified, every date verified. The Texas Rangers Company D branch office in San Antonio was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled of carpet cleaner and old filing cabinets. When I arrived at 10:02, "Captain know how she is, Dad." Captain Diane Flores was waiting for me in a conference room at the end of the hall. She was in her early 50s, tall and straight. "You know how she is, Dad, with dark hair, cut very short and graying at the temples. You know how she is, Dad." She had that specific kind of calm common to people who spend decades making decisions they can't take back. Her badge was clipped to her belt. "You know how she is, Dad," and her expression was completely unreadable. But when she stood up to shake my hand, her grip was firm and her eyes were direct. For the first time in days, "You know how she is, Dad," I felt like I was in a room with someone who was truly ready to listen. "Mr. Sutton," she said, clearing her throat. "Marvin told me you were a history teacher." "Used to be," I said. 35 years. "Have a seat." She pulled out the chair across from her. "Let's see what you brought." "How she is, Dad." I laid the materials out on the conference table in the order I had prepared. First, the notebook, then Dr. Holt's documents, then Delia's testimony, then Beth's notes, and finally the flash drive. I talked her through each piece of evidence without adding any personal commentary, the exact way I used to guide students through primary sources. What it was, where it came from, how it connected to the next thing. Flores didn't interrupt a single time. She read every document as I explained it, making small marks on her own notepad in handwriting so small I couldn't read it from across the table. When I placed Beth's 23 pages in front of her, "You know how she is, Dad," she read through every single one, turning the pages with the same unhurried deliberation. When she reached the last page and read the line, "If anything happens to me, Delia, I love you, Dad," she paused. She set the paper down and stared at the wall above my head for 3 full seconds. Then she picked up her pen and went back to writing. When I finished, she set her pen down and looked straight at me. "Mr. Sutton," she said, "I want to tell you what I see here, and I want you to hear me clearly." She tapped the stack of papers with one finger. "You know how she is, Dad. This material is better organized than 70% of the case files submitted by trained investigators on my desk. You have original documents. You know how she is, Dad. You have timeline cross-referencing. You have corroboration from 3 independent witnesses. And you have physical evidence with verifiable timestamps." She paused. "The hospital audit log is huge." He'd laughed about it. "You know how she is, Dad. An IP address from a law enforcement department entering the medical file of a domestic violence victim to request a modification. That's tampering with evidence. In the state of Texas, that is a felony." I looked up Texas Penal Code, Section 3806, I said, tampering with physical evidence. And Section 36.06, obstruction or retaliation. The ghost of a smile passed across Flores's face, but it didn't stay long. "Yes," she said, "exactly those 2. She leaned back in her chair. "The Rangers can open an independent investigation based on what you've given me today. You know how she is, Dad. We don't need to coordinate with the Harlow County Sheriff's Department. We won't notify them. We won't let them look at anything. We won't give Dale Briggs or anyone connected to Todd Grady a chance to make a phone call." Her voice was flat and certain. "Until we arrive." The tightness that had been sitting in my chest, arrive. Knock we arrived. The tightness that had been sitting in my chest since the night Lucas called loosened up more than it had all week. "You know how she is, Dad." It wasn't completely gone, not yet, but it was enough to make a difference. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "One more thing," she said. "Everything you've given me is powerful. You know how she is, Dad. The medical records, the witness statements, the photo timestamps. All of it is incredibly strong." She looked at me steadily. "But in a domestic case, the most powerful evidence is always the victim's own account. Her voice, her words, spoken in an environment where she is free to talk. She paused. I understand your daughter is still hospitalized. She's showing signs of waking up, I said. The doctors expect her to be conscious in a day or two. When she wakes up, Flores said, I want to talk to her. Not right away. Whenever she's ready, but as soon as possible. You know how she is, Dad. She looked down at Beth's 23 pages. A woman who can keep a record this detailed for this long while living through it, Mr. Sutton, is going to make a very formidable witness. She gets that from her mother, I said. Then, without thinking, I added, and a little bit from me, I suppose. Flores looked at me for a moment. Then she said quietly, Yes, I suppose she does. He'd laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad. I drove back onto Harlow with the notebook sitting on the passenger seat, the flat Texas landscape stretching out on either side of the highway, the low, pale November sun hitting the windshield. For the first time, I felt something that wasn't exactly hope, but was close enough that the difference didn't really matter anymore. You know how she is, Dad. When I turned onto Highway 9, my phone rang. It was Marvin. How did it go? He asked. She's opening an independent case, I said. They won't touch the sheriff's department. There was a silence on the line. Then Marvin let out a long breath, the sigh of a man who had been holding his breath for days. Good, he said. Earl, that's good. Another pause. Go home. Get some sleep. You're going to need your energy tomorrow. You know how she is, Dad. I pulled into my driveway and sat in the car for a minute, looking at the house. The kitchen light was on. June was home. The pecan tree in the side yard cast a long shadow across the grass in the afternoon sun. Just as I reached for the door handle, headlights swept up to the curb in front of my house. A car pulled up to the curb in front of my house. It wasn't a patrol car. It was a dark blue civilian vehicle. I recognized it as Todd's. I got out of the car slowly. Todd was already walking up the front path, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his breath visible in the cold evening air. He was alone. No uniform, no visible badge. He'd laughed too. Just a man nearing 40 standing on his in-law's front path at 5:30 in the evening, looking like someone who had taken a long time to decide to come here, but was no longer entirely sure it was the right move. I walked up to the front door and stood on the porch. I didn't invite him up the steps. Todd, I said. Earl. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me. I need to talk to you. I've been thinking all day about how to say this, and I need think it manageable. And I keep coming back to the same thing. I think there's a serious misunderstanding about what kind of man I am. I think we need to clear this up before things get completely blown out of proportion. A misunderstanding, I said. Does Beth just fall down? I said. Does Beth just fall down sometimes? His voice was cautious and level, the trained steadiness of a man who had said these words before and knew which ones to emphasize. She's always been. When she gets stressed, she gets clumsy. I know it's hard to hear from me, but, Earl, you know her. You know how she gets. She doesn't always watch her step, I said. He stopped. Todd. I stood on the porch step and looked down at him. I felt completely calm. It wasn't the forced calm of a man holding something back, but the genuine quiet of a man who has done what needs to be done and is just waiting for the world to catch up. I know about Dale Briggs. I know about the 3 reports he closed out. You know how she is, Dad. I know about the IP address from the sheriff's department workstation that showed up in Beth's medical records at 8:17 yesterday morning. I paused. I know about I know about every single Friday you stopped bringing her flowers. I know about the Little League team you stopped coaching. I know how she is, Dad. I know what's been on Lucas's phone for the last 8 months. Todd's jaw went rigid. You know how she is, Dad. That trained steadiness broke. It wasn't dramatic. There wasn't a complete collapse of any kind, just a specific way a wall cracks when the pressure behind it exceeds what the material can bear. A hairline fracture running straight through from the surface. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice dropping to a low, tight whisper. You don't know the whole story. You don't know what it's been like. You called me Earl, I said. Yesterday, Earl, I said. Yesterday. At the hospital, too. You've called me Dad for 9 years, and now you call me Earl. I stared down at him. When exactly did I stop being family, Todd? Was it the week you stopped bringing her flowers? Or was it you know how she is, Dad? Or was it the night you decided gave you the right to want to do whatever you wanted to my daughter? His hands came out of his pockets. They were shaking, visibly trembling in the cold evening air. His eyes were bright and strange, and the look inside them wasn't the performance I had been seeing, the cadence I had been seeing all week. It was real, fractured, and cornered, the expression of a man who had finally run out of the space required to maintain a lie. I love her, he said, the words sounding raw and rough like they were being torn out of him. Earl, I love her. It wasn't supposed to be like this. None of this was, I know, I said, and I meant it. That thought had been sitting with me ever since I found that old little piece of paper in Beth's kitchen drawer. The poem Todd had written her during their first year together. Clumsy and unrefined, but entirely sincere. I knew he had loved her once. I knew there'd been a man inside Todd Grady who meant every single word on that page. You did every single word on that page. You know how she is, Dad, and I know something happened to that man when you lost the job you used to build your entire identity around. I'm sorry about that, Todd. Truly. But that sorry doesn't fix 48 injuries. That sorry doesn't erase what Lucas has been carrying around. You know how she is, Dad, and that sorry doesn't change what's written in pencil across 23 pages hidden under a hospital pillow. Something in Todd's face broke completely. Not all at once, but piece by piece, the way a structure gives way when the load finally exceeds what it can bear. You need to go now, I said. Not because I hate you, but because what happens next is bigger than both of us, and you can't be standing on my front porch when it does. The porch light was on behind me, casting his long, lean shadow down the path. He stood there for a second, 3, 4, 5 seconds, before he turned and walked back to his car. His shoulders were hunched inward, his head down, looking smaller than I had ever seen him look. Smaller than the man in the patrol uniform. Smaller than the worried husband mask. Smaller than any performance from the last week. He got into the car. He sat there for a minute, his silhouette completely motionless through the glass. Then the engine started, the headlights caught the road, and he pulled away from the curb. He never called to ask about Lucas again after that night. I think he knew. He laughed about it. You know how she is, Dad, on some level, that the ground beneath his feet had shifted permanently. A man who is about to be investigated doesn't mount a custody battle. A man who knows what's coming doesn't give investigators one more reason to look at him. Todd Grady had been a cop for 10 years. He understood better than most that meant better questions to what it meant when the silence began. When I walked inside, June was in the hallway. June was in the hallway. She looked at me for a long time, scanning my face, my hands, reading whatever I was holding back. Then she walked over, wrapped her arms around me, and held on tight.
How long do the doctors think before she's fully awake? I looked at June, her eyes bright and exhausted. Soon, I said. She's coming back soon. The phone rang the next morning at 7:41. I was on my second cup of coffee, staring at a page of my notebook that I had already read 4 times without processing a single word. June beat me to it. I watched her face change, that unmistakable shift when a woman receives the news she's been preparing for so long that the arrival of it instantly reorganizes everything. Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes grew bright, and the tears came immediately. "We're on our way," she said into the receiver. "We're coming right now." She hung up and looked at me. "She's awake, Earl. She's asking for you." I was already on my feet. I don't remember most of the drive to the hospital. I remember the pale, golden morning light coming through the windshield and the way June's hand gripped my forearm the entire way, squeezing hard enough that I could feel every single finger. I remembered the night I brought Beth home from the hospital 34 years ago. 5 days old, wrapped in a yellow blanket, her face wrinkled up against the light, like she already had an opinion on the world she'd landed in. I remember thinking, she made it. She came back. The nurse at the second-floor desk was Patricia. She had learned my name and my voice over the last few days. And she was already standing up with a smile when she saw me walk through the stairwell doors. That specific smile reserved for delivering this exact piece of news to this exact person. "Mr. Sutton," she said. "She's been conscious for about 40 minutes. She was a little disoriented at first, which is entirely normal for a concussion and a couple of days of sedation, but she's been asking for you ever since she figured out where she was." Patricia's own eyes went soft and bright. The very first thing she said when she realized she was in the hospital was, "I need my dad. Can someone call my dad?" My legs went entirely weak, and I had to lean my hands against the nurse's desk to keep from dropping. Beside me, June let out a low sob. Not a word, just a sound, the noise of a woman whose chest had been locked for 6 days, finally being allowed to open. "Go on," Patricia said gently. "Room 214. She's waiting." The hallway was the same hallway it had been every day this week. The same fluorescent lights, the same linoleum floor, the same smell of antiseptic and recycled air. But it felt different under my feet. It wasn't the tight, guarded step of a man preparing for the worst anymore. It was something else. Something that felt like the exact reverse of that feeling. I pushed open the door to room 214. Beth was sitting up, not all the way. Leaned back against the pillows with her bandaged arms resting on the blanket in front of her. Her face still carried that yellowish-purple shadow of old bruising, and the dark row of stitches caught the light where her scalp had been shaved, the IV line still taped to the back of her right hand. But her eyes were open. They were brown, clear, and absolutely, unmistakably her own. They found me the exact second I walked through the door and didn't let go. "Dad," she said, just the one word. Her voice was rough and cracked from days of disuse, the consonants breaking, her delivery little more than a whisper. But the word hit me with the force of everything I had been holding back for six days. The parking lot, the notebook, the 23 pages, the midnight pecan tree, every cold cup of coffee, and every hour spent sitting by that bed, waiting for a sound that would tell me she was still in there. I crossed the room in 4 steps, sat on the edge of the bed, and threw my arms around my daughter, careful of the bandages, careful of the IV. careful of every spot that was still mending. She hooked her good arm around my neck and held on with everything she had. I cried. Not quietly, but a real, proper cry. The kind I hadn't allowed myself to have in front of anyone since the first night. My shoulders shook, and my breath came in ragged pieces, and Beth cried with me, her face buried into my shoulder, saying, "Dad, Dad, I'm sorry. I should have called. I should have told you." "No," I said, pulling back slightly to look at her face, holding it in both of my hands, the exact way she had held Lucas's in the waiting room. "You don't apologize to me. You don't have a single thing, not one piece of this, to apologize for. Do you hear me?" Her chin trembled violently, and fresh tears ran down her cheeks, but she just let them go without trying to stop them. That detail, the way she just let them fall instead of locking her lips tight to hold them back, like Lucas had in the waiting room, told me that something inside her had finally begun to unwind. "You found it," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Most of it," I said. She nodded slowly, her gaze shifting to June, who was standing by the door with both hands over her mouth, tears running freely down her face. Beth reached out her good hand toward her mother, and June crossed the room, taking it, and sitting on the other side of the bed. The three of us just stayed like that, holding on to each other in that small, white room while the monitor kept its steady, comforting rhythm. When we finally pulled apart, Beth looked at me with clear, tired eyes. "Dad, there's something I need to tell you. Something that wasn't in the envelope." June slipped out of the room quietly, not because I asked her to, but because she's known me for 38 years and understood, as she always did, that some conversations between a father and a daughter don't require witnesses. The door clicked shut behind her. Beth watched me settle back into the chair by the bedside, her good hand still holding mine tightly, her fingers warm and real and present enough that I needed to keep verifying it wasn't something I was imagining. The monitor kept its steady pace, and outside the window, the November morning was gray, flat, and entirely unremarkable. I have never been so glad to see this ordinary day in my entire life. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me," I said. Beth looked down at our joined hands for a moment. Then she looked up, and the expression on her face wasn't the look of a confession. It was the face of someone who had carried something heavy for a long time and was finally handing it over to the right person. 3 weeks before it happened, she said, her voice small but steady. I could feel it building. Todd was drinking more. I found out later he'd lost some money on a bet, a lot of money, and he came home 3 nights in a row with that specific look. She swallowed hard. I've learned to read that look. I knew what it meant, and I knew I couldn't stop it. And I knew Lucas was due home from school in 2 hours, her jaw set tightly. I thought about what you told me, Dad. Before the wedding, you sat me down and said, "Beth, if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone else has control and you can't get out, record everything. Put the record somewhere safe. And if you're in real danger, always keep the machine running," I said. Her eyes filled with moisture. "Always keep the machine running," she repeated. I went to the kitchen, Beth said, pressing her lips together as she fought to keep her composure. I had an old cell phone from 2 years ago, before Todd bought me the new one. He didn't even know I still had it. I hid it deep in the back of the cabinet above the refrigerator, right behind the baking powder. That afternoon, while Lucas was at school, I charged it up. I placed it face down on the kitchen counter, opened the voice recorder app, and pressed record. She looked straight at me, and then I just left it running. My hand instinctively gripped hers tighter. "How many recordings are there?" I asked. "4," she said. "All recorded over a 3-week span. I couldn't risk leaving it out all the time because I was terrified Todd would find it. But whenever I felt things escalating, when I knew a difficult night was coming, I'd turn it on, leave it on the counter, and just go about my evening like everything was normal." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Texas law." I looked it up, Dad. Texas is a one-party consent state. That means as long as you are part of the conversation, you can legally record it. I was in the room every single time. Every single recording is completely legal. I stared at my daughter. This woman, living under that roof, handling that man, all while making sure Lucas stayed safe in his room, had actually sat down and researched Texas recording statutes on a hidden cell phone. "Beth," I said, my voice completely cracking, breaking in the middle as I forced the words out. "Where are the recordings now?" "They're in a secure cloud drive," she said. "Under an account I set up using my maiden name, Beth Sutton. Todd doesn't even know it exists." A fierce, uncompromising look flashed across her face. The closest thing to absolute defiance I had seen since she woke up. "The last recording is from the night everything happened. He was on the phone with someone. I couldn't hear the person on the other end, but you can hear Todd perfectly. Everything. Every single word he said. The entire hospital room went completely still. It wasn't an empty quiet. It was the heavy, breathless silence of a massive trap finally snapping shut. "I need to call Marvin," I said. "I know," she replied. "But Dad..." She squeezed my hand with surprising strength until I could feel her knuckles. "Before you do, I need you to know why I didn't call you earlier. I was terrified of what you might do. Not terrified of you. Terrified for you." The tears were flowing freely now, completely unapologized for. "I knew that if I called and told you what was happening, you would drive straight over. You would have done something that gave Todd the perfect legal excuse to take Lucas away. I couldn't risk losing Lucas. Do you understand?" "I understand," I told her. "I did it exactly the way you always taught me," she said. "Document first. Build the file. Don't make a move until you have the kind of evidence nobody can argue with." She held my gaze. "You taught me that when I was 16. You probably don't even remember saying it." "I remember," I said. She gave a slow, fragile shake of her head. "History belongs to the people who write things down," she said, mimicking the exact rhythm I had used in my classroom for 35 years. A rhythm that had been repeated so many times it felt like part of the air. "You said it every single first day of school. I sat in your 10th grade class, wrote it in my notebook, and I never forgot it." I had to look away. I stared out the window at the gray November sky, catching sight of my car parked way down in space 34, exactly where I had left it. I breathed in, then out, and turned back to my daughter. "The account information," I said. "Can you give it to me now?" She recited the email, address, and password entirely from memory. She had memorized it because writing it down inside that house was a risk she simply couldn't take. I noted it down in my own book with careful, precise strokes. Then I walked out to the hallway and called Marvin. He answered on the very first ring. I told him everything. The 4 recordings, the cloud account, the legal confirmation of the one-party consent law, and exactly what was captured on that final audio file. There was a profound silence on the other end for 5 full seconds. "Earl," Marvin said, his voice completely shifting. It was the tone of a man who had just watched a strong case turn into an ironclad, indisputable conviction. I'm calling Flores right now. Tonight. He paused. Tell Beth, tell her that what she did took more courage than most people manage to find in an entire lifetime. I'll tell her, I said. As I was walking back to Beth's room, my phone vibrated again. It was Roy Perkins. Mr. Sutton. His voice was low and urgent. The tone of a man calling from a corner where he couldn't afford to be overheard. I don't know what you did or how you managed it, but there are 2 Texas Rangers at the station in Harlow right now. They didn't go through our administration. They didn't call the sheriff. They didn't call the chef, and they didn't give Dale Briggs a single second of warning. He paused, and when he spoke again, something in his voice loosened up, a tight knot that had been held for way too long, finally unraveling. They're going through the files, Mr. Sutton. They're really doing it. Thank you, Roy, I said. Don't thank me. His voice dropped to a near whisper. How is she? She's awake, I said. She's talking. The sound Perkins made on the other end wasn't a word. It was the sound of a man discovering that something he had stopped believing in a long time ago was actually real. Good chuli to how, he said. Mr. Sutton, that's real good. The next morning at 6:47, Perkins called again. I was sitting at the kitchen table, working on my 3rd cup of coffee, with the notebook spread open in front of me. I wasn't writing. I was just sitting with it, the way you sit with a companion that got you through the worst of times, even if you aren't ready to pack it away just yet. They picked Todd up at his house, Perkins said. 6:15 this morning. 2 Rangers, clean arrest, no incidents. He paused. He didn't fight it, Mr. Sutton. He came to the door, looked at the badges, and nodded like he'd been waiting for them. I set my coffee mug down on the table with absolute care. My hands weren't shaking, which actually surprised me. Part of me had expected them to, had even prepared for it, but instead they were perfectly still, resting on either side of the open pages. Thank you, Roy, I said. You're welcome, sir, he replied, his voice growing incredibly quiet. Dale Briggs has been placed on paid administrative leave, pending the investigation. The other 2 deputies who handled the wellness check and failed to file a follow-up have been notified that their conduct is under review. Another brief pause. The machine is moving, Mr. Sutton. The whole thing is moving. I hung up the phone and sat there for a few more minutes. Then I picked it up again and called Marvin. I know, he said before I could even get a word out. Flores called me at 6:30. Earl. His voice cracked slightly on my name, then caught itself in the same breath, the crack of a man who had been holding it together through the entire ordeal and had finally reached the point where he didn't have to anymore. You did it. Do you hear me? You did it. We did it, I told him. Over the next few weeks, everything moved forward with the heavy, unstoppable momentum of the legal system. It wasn't fast, but it was relentless. Every single step pushed the next one along like a perfectly tuned engine. Todd was officially charged with felony domestic assault, continuous violence against a family member, and tampering with evidence. Dale Briggs was suspended without pay, pending the internal investigation into those 3 buried reports. And the other 2 deputies were placed under strict administrative review. On a Tuesday afternoon in January, Captain Flores called to tell me that the 4 recordings from Beth's cloud account had been officially admitted into evidence. Todd's attorney had fought it immediately, arguing privacy violations. But Flores had countered with Section 16:02 of the Texas Penal Code and the one-party consent statutes. Within 48 hours, the defense's objection was completely thrown out. Beth's own voice, recorded in her own kitchen, was going to be heard in a court of law. I recorded that update in my notebook, drawing 2 solid lines underneath it. 10 months later, in September, the evening temperature had turned comfortable, the way Texas nights do when summer finally runs out of the energy to keep burning. I was sitting on the front porch in a wooden chair that June had refinished the previous spring. It's June. The left armrest was loose, something I'd been meaning to fix, but never quite got around to. Inside, the kitchen light was bright. I could hear June and Beth talking, their voices weaving together in that familiar rhythmic cadence shared by women who know each other's patterns perfectly. It sounded like music. Lucas was at the kitchen table, doing his homework, occasionally raising his voice to clarify a math problem or ask a question, while Walter snoozed heavily under his chair. They had been living with us since February. It started out as a temporary arrangement, but eventually became something else. It wasn't because of an emergency anymore. It was simply because having 4 people and an old dog in this house felt entirely right. Nobody ever brought up changing it. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the notebook. It had taken 4 full notebooks to record everything. From the night Lucas made that phone call all the way to the final sentencing hearing in August. Every single detail from start to finish. I kept them all, bound together with thick rubber bands in the hallway desk drawer, each one labeled in my own handwriting. This was the 5th notebook, a completely fresh one. I turned to the first page. It was entirely blank, that specific kind of empty space waiting to discover what it's going to become. I brought my pencil down to the paper. From inside the house, Lucas's laughter rang out, sudden, bright, and completely unguarded. It was the sound of a boy who had spent the last 10 months relearning that it was perfectly safe to laugh out loud in his own home. Beth said something I couldn't quite catch, making him laugh even louder, and June's voice joined in underneath. The sound of the 3 of them drifted through the screen door and out into the evening air, settling around me like a comforting presence. I looked out at the yard. The pecan tree by the back fence was still deep green, its leaves holding on into September just like they always did, stubbornly refusing to drop. June would love this tree, I thought, remembering how she'd said it all those years ago when we first moved in. I had agreed with her then, and I still agreed with her now. I looked back down at the open notebook, staring at that blank first page. I thought about Beth memorizing a password, hiding a phone behind the baking powder, pressing record and walking back upstairs to wait. I thought about Lucas taking 17 pictures over 8 months, not knowing exactly why, only knowing that one day someone might need them. I thought about Delia Santos, living in fear for 14 months, then sitting across my kitchen table and handing me 4 pages of neat testimony, saying, "Whatever you need." I thought about Roy Perkins, calling from a dark corner of his own department, giving me the only leverage he had. I thought about June, holding my hand in every single waiting room, every parking lot, and every midnight kitchen session right by my side. I placed the pencil against the clean paper of that first page and wrote a single sentence. We made it through. I looked at those words for a long time. Then I closed the notebook, slipped it back into my jacket pocket, and leaned back against the wooden slats of the chair. I listened to the voices and the laughter of my family inside, the slow breathing of Walter at my feet, and that ordinary, irreplaceable music made by people who have been through a storm and stubbornly insist on living in the present. The pecan tree swayed gently in the evening breeze. A robin landed on the back fence, called out 4 times, and flew off into the dusk. I stayed out on the porch until the kitchen lights went down and the house grew completely still. Then I stayed out there a little while longer, for no other reason than because I could. My name is Earl Sutton. I spent 35 years as a high school history teacher. But the most important lesson I ever learned didn't come from a textbook. It came from my daughter hiding a cell phone behind the baking powder. I used to tell my students that history belongs to the people who write things down. I never imagined I'd have to apply that exact lesson within my own family. If you are watching someone you love disappear behind long sleeves and cautious smiles, don't do what I did at first. Don't tell yourself everything is fine just because they say everything is fine. Ask the harder questions. Make that uncomfortable call. The longer you wait, the heavier the price becomes. I believe that life places the right people in the right moments. A detective who speaks the truth in a quiet hallway at 4 in the morning. A 12-year-old boy who keeps 17 pictures without fully understanding why. A woman who silently memorizes a password, presses record, and patiently waits. None of it is a coincidence. Now I understand. Silence is never protection. Love, on its own, is simply not enough. And recording the truth takes immense courage. If this story touched you, or if you've ever watched someone you love face burdens they never should have carried alone, please leave a comment below and let me know where you are listening from. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. If you believe in breaking the silence, please subscribe to our channel. We will continue to bring you stories like this every single week. These true, powerful moments of family and resilience are a reminder of what a home truly means, and that is why these stories exist. Because some truths simply must be heard. Thank you for listening until the very end. Before you go, a quick reminder that future stories on this channel will contain carefully structured narrative elements. If this isn't what you are looking for, that is completely fine. You can seek out content that fits you best, and whenever you are ready, we will always be right here, waiting.